And I want to welcome and thank you all for joining us for the first in a series of webinars designed to help you, designed to provide you with the skills and resources to increase the impact of your community science projects. For some of you, that might mean getting more of your neighbors involved in specific actions like planting trees or monitoring air or water quality. And for others, it might mean engaging policymakers in environmental health initiatives or climate action plans. And some of you might be those policymakers or working for the government and interested in engaging more fully with the communities that you're serving. So this workshop is meant to help all of you identify who specifically you want to engage with, what your ask is, and how to convey it effectively. In future workshops, we'll take deeper dives in how to interact with specific types of audiences towards specific goals, and as we were just discussing, in specific ways. Be that Twitter or Facebook or newspaper. I'll be sending out calendar invitations for the next several workshops. This is the first of a series that we're doing specifically through the cohort to which you belong, the Science Policy and Engagement cohort. So keep your eyes open for those calendar invitations, and please put them on your calendars. Would love to have you join all 6. And as a big ask from us, again, this is the first time we're doing this. So if you have a specific request for future workshops, if there's something about these that you really like or really don't like, please let us know. We'll have, of course, a survey. We love our surveys at the end of the workshop, and totally open to always just talking about it. So with that, I'd like to turn the workshop over to my colleagues from AGU's Sharing Science, Media Relations, and Public Affairs departments, as well as our own Thriving Earth Exchange Communications Manager. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves as they come on. We'll stop for questions along the way, but if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box, raise your hand. I'll be the chat elf for most of the seminar today. So just speak up and let us know what we can do to help make this as useful to you as possible. So with that, I think Olivia is up.
Sure. Thanks, Erin. And let me just ask Kelly, I think you're running the slides. Do I have control also, or shall I just ask you to advance them as we go forward?
You can go ahead and ask me.
Okay, sounds good. But before I begin, let me introduce myself, and then I'll let my colleagues Liz and Nancy introduce themselves as well. So hello, everyone. Very nice to meet you, or at least get a chance to talk to you. I hope we'll get to talk more in the next couple hours. I'm Olivia Ambrosio, and I manage the Sharing Science program at AGU, which is essentially the way in which we support scientists in communicating in a way that actually matters to audiences beyond scientists, whether that's students, whether that's their neighbors, whether that's policymakers, whether that's journalists, whoever it might be. And we provide a lot of resources to do that. I myself am a biologist by training. I got my PhD studying the sex lives of marine snails, which are surprisingly interesting, in case anyone's wondering. Happy to talk about that in the chat later. But you know, the chasm between how people perceived science within the sciences and outside of it was really obvious to me. I have a background in writing as well, so I moved into this sort of science communication niche. And it's been about 11 years now that I've been facilitating workshops and developing resources in the SciComm realm. And Liz, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
I'd love to. Thanks so much, Olivia. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Landau. I am the Director of Public Affairs here at AGU. And while we call our department Public Affairs, it's really all about policy and connecting scientists and policy together. So for the past 13 years, I've been working for AGU here, helping get good science into policy, helping people communicate with policymakers, and figuring out how to improve our policies so they're more scientifically sound. My background is also in the sciences. Unlike Olivia, I study things that have been dead for millions of years, but also, got really interested in this interface between science and the rest of the world, and have been doing that for the past decade plus. Nancy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. My name is Nancy Bumpy. I'm the Director of Media Relations here at AGU. And we're part of a communications department here. So we, of course, interface with the media, but also kind of all of communications for AGU, including social media, whatever you can think of that needs communications and marketing at AGU. We are your folks, but also working closely with the press, with the media. My background is I also have a degree in science. I was a chemist and then became a newspaper reporter. So worked for a local newspaper and then worked in Washington covering policy as well. So, and then came to AGU doing communications for about, how long have I been there? 7 or 8 years, I forget. But really excited to meet you guys and talk to you today. So with that, I guess I'll hand it back over to Olivia.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Kelly. So I just want to start a little bit, and I know this is essentially preaching to the choir here, but I want to talk a little bit about why this cohort that you are a part of for Thriving Earth Exchange is so exciting and important, and why this aspect of communication and engagement is so critical. Could I have the next slide, Kelly? So we have to talk about this a lot, often with scientists, to convince them of why they need to actually talk to other people about their science. And I just want to give one example from that realm. A number of years ago now, in 2011, there was an earthquake outside of DC, but it was felt sort of throughout the Washington, DC area. And my boss at the time was getting a lot of phone calls from reporters saying, oh, do you have any people we can interview to talk about earthquakes? So yes, she did, of course. And she reached out to a local seismologist and asked, hey, can I put you in touch with these journalists? Could I have the next slide, Kelly? The seismologist said, oh no, those aren't the kind of earthquakes I study. And I give this as an example just because I think this is a sadly great example of a real lost opportunity, right? And misunderstanding on every end. Obviously the journalists weren't going to ask the seismologist questions that were really specific to the kind of earthquake that this was. They were going to ask her things like, why did this happen now? Is there anything different? Can we expect more earthquakes in this area? What should people do about earthquakes? Why is it that we can't really predict earthquakes very much in advance? All those kinds of questions that anybody who studies any kind of earthquakes would be able to answer, or at least should be able to answer, with the real focus being on what people in the area who felt this care about. So I mention that just because this is not knowing what people want to get out of an interaction or how you can actually provide what they need is, I think, sometimes the first lost opportunity, really, in not reaching out to others. Could I have the next slide, Kelly? So sometimes what we say and what we ask is, if science happens in a vacuum and no one understands it, does it really matter? And the next slide, please. And I argue that's really the same thing with your project. Obviously, it's going to matter to your community regardless. It's going to have an impact there. But it has the potential to have so much more impact, depending on what more you can do to talk with others about why this matters and about why it matters for them as well as for you. Next slide, please, Kelly. So for one example, as what you're working on, you do this collaboration and have confirmed that wetlands in your area are really critical and they're providing this tremendous buffer from flooding. Okay, great, but now what? What's the health of these wetlands? Are they being protected? Are the people who might take care of them and not pollute them or not develop over them aware of what the benefits are? Or do you just know, but that doesn't necessarily have an impact on the area? Or a collaboration has developed a new tool that is allowing farmers at a much more local level to find out what kind of soil moisture and water levels exist. That's terrific. But because it's at a local level, farmers elsewhere don't even know that it exists. So people in other areas are not getting the benefits of this new development. Or, okay, now there's a way for folks to measure air pollution. Well, what are you finding out about air pollution? Is there a change? Why is there a change? Is there a negative change? Is there more pollution? If so, and you know what's causing it, or you can find a correlation, are the people who have some power to affect what's going on there aware of this also? Are the people who can put pressure on those people aware of this also? Next one, please, Kelly. Or you find that, yes, there's more lead in the water supply. That could be affecting urban gardens. Do the urban gardeners themselves know this, for one thing? If so, do they know what the next steps might be to have some sort of remediation? Do we know if there are people who are aware of where the lead is coming from and how to reduce it? Are there people in other areas, if you know what's causing the lead, who might have the same problem but don't even know that there's an increase in lead in the water supply? Next, please, Kelly. And I have this drawing of mine up, not because you need to see a sea slug looking at a submarine necessarily, although who doesn't, but more as just a reminder to me that with scientists, I think especially, and certainly because those are the people I work most with, but with everybody who's working on something very specific, we tend to get so immersed in what we're doing and that its value, its importance, its wider significance is just blindingly obvious to us. But it is not obvious to other people. And that's why part of engaging more broadly is about making really explicit the importance of what's happening. Next slide, please, Kelly. So again, as you're working on your project, as you're developing your collaborations, as you're finding your results, all of this, ask beyond your community, in your area, who knows about this issue and or who doesn't but really should, because it also either affects them in some way or they can affect it in some way. Similarly, in the wider sphere of decision makers who might affect this, who already knows what's going on and who doesn't but should, because they could actually be a force for good to extend the impact of what you're working on. Similarly, on a much wider scale, are there other communities that would benefit from knowing what you did, because then they could do the same thing? Or other places that need to know so that they don't do something that you found out about that is affecting the area? Or are there just other places that need to know how valuable these sorts of community-driven science-based works can be to address issues that derive from a community and need to know more about why this could help them in the sort of broader process sense? So these are all things to think about, both in terms of how you can get sort of a greater impact out of your own project, and also how you can assist others who might be in a situation similar to yours but not even know it. Next, please, Kelly. And with that, Liz is going to tell you a bit more about how to do all of this.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. I really appreciate that introduction. So clearly, if you weren't already convinced, engagement and communication of what you're doing to broader audiences is incredibly important. But how do you make sure that you're engaging others in your work and that it's effective? So that's the conversation that we want to start today with all of you. We hope to provide you with some ideas and some guidance that will help you decide how to best share and communicate the really important work that you're doing to all of those other people who are not directly involved in your project, but who will find value in knowing about your efforts, even if they don't quite know it yet. Next slide, please. So let's talk about effective engagement to help your community and your project that you're working on. This is our roadmap that we are going to go through today. We're going to talk about how you get to know your audience, who they are and what they care about, so that you can really create a two-way dialogue and ensure that you're having productive conversations with them and they're interested in hearing about your project and contributing in whatever way it is that you want them to. How to communicate really clearly, without jargon, without, putting someone off with the way that you're speaking with them. That'll be really helpful for various audiences who you maybe don't communicate with regularly. how to create those tailored messages with impact that help you get across what you want and help you move your project forward. And then we're going to connect it all back to the bigger picture as well. So it's all part of this larger process that you're working on through this program. So we'll take questions at the end of each section, but feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. Our team is monitoring the chat throughout the presentations. And then we also have time built into today to work on these key components of engagement for a variety of audiences with feedback from us and from your cohort if any of them are on. And we will be actually giving you some things to work on today. So we'll have some active time. And then after today, you'll have the documents ready to go to help you out with all the effective engagement that you want to do throughout the life of your project. And as was mentioned before, this is just the first in a series of courses that we'll have for you. And in future courses, we'll dive deeper into specific audiences and we'll share best practices for tools like social media, storytelling, and other things that'll be useful to you and your team throughout your project. So I want to make sure I say thank you so much for being here with us today. Throughout the next 2 hours, just let us know how we can help you. We'll also be sending a survey after this to make sure that we get feedback from you on what was and wasn't helpful, so we can be sure to give you more helpful courses in the future. And now I'm going to hand it over to Kelly, who will explore, excuse me, thinking about your audiences with you.
Thanks, Liz and Olivia. Echoing the thanks to all of you for being on the line today. And yes, please, at any time, drop questions in the chat. We're going to start by thinking about, at a broad level, who is your audience? The focus of this session today is on framing your message to meet your project goals. And that means there might be a range of groups that you're trying to reach to get the word out about your project and the milestones you're meeting or the work that you're trying to do. Regardless of whether you're focusing on telling someone about science or your community science project, we never want to be in a situation where, because of the framing of our message, we're not getting a great response from the audience. So we're going to avoid this situation right here. And we'll dive in a little bit deeper to very specific audiences and strategies to build and frame your message to specific groups. But I wanted to actually pause before we get into the thick of it and ask you all, you're here to learn more about framing your messaging. And I know that everyone's projects are different in scope, but I wanted to know if you could drop into the chat if you have a specific objective in mind while you're here today. Do you have an audience that you're really trying to get engaged with, or do you have a specific group that you are hoping to use what we do today to talk to later on? Please take a moment or two to drop those ideas in the chat. Thanks for dropping those. Seeing a lot of fellow community residents and also policymakers in the local area. Garrett, noting that your comment there's sort of a broad community and then a like more focused group being the ranchers in that region. Multilingual populations, government staff, and residents. It's important to have in mind when you're starting to work out a specific message who you're talking to. And a lot of what you all have shared is sort of in line with some of these broad categories of groups that we work with often. This list is not exhaustive, and you can keep adding to the chat if you have more suggestions. What'll happen later on is you'll have time to actually build out an engagement action plan. And it might make sense for you to focus specifically on the audience you suggested here, or if you've got a couple in mind that you're trying to reach. We hope that you can walk away today with something concrete that you can use with that specific group. So this first half will be giving you some broad strategies, but then we'll be able to dig back into these focused groups that you've shared with us just now. So thanks for doing that. Some other groups outside of fellow residents and policymakers might be, in order to channel to, I saw someone dropped in K-12 students or elementary students. You could use some of these suggestions as channels as well. So you might reach an audience through another vehicle, which is another group you want to work on messaging toward. We will focus today on fellow community members, media outlets, and policymakers, but we're happy to answer specific questions as we move along. In order to, after you've identified the audience that you really want to work with more closely, to build that connection, whether it's started already and you're just trying to deepen it, or if you're really starting to initiate a partnership with a group you want to engage with, we have this framework that you'll see this again. I just wanted to share it briefly here. But when we're thinking about putting a message together for one of these groups, the first thing we recommend is thinking about your specific goals related to your project. What outcome do you want with the engagement you're about to embark on with that specific audience? Once you've identified on your end what your goals are, sort of doing a little bit of a role shift and thinking about the audience's goals, their demographics, their values and interests, and just starting to put together how that group's values might align with the work that you're doing. This is an example. It's, so I love this comic, illustrated by Olivia on the line, but this is something that can come up in science or any type of work that you're doing. It's relevant to that, the mammal and the submarine idea. It's easy for us to get caught up in the specific work that we're doing. If I was working in a lab where we were synthesizing nanocrystals and I tried to tell someone how excited I was about that work, my family member wouldn't care unless I made the connection that the materials we were working on was useful for improving cell phone technology. So finding something that's relevant to the audience you're talking with, whether it's in an example related to a lab or in an example related to broader community science, is important. When you're framing your message, it's not ever about trying to convince someone of something. It's not about trying to bring someone over to our specific viewpoint, but it is about putting the information and knowledge that you have in context that is important to the group that you're talking with. What are the shared values everyone can connect on? Our children's future, our health, water quality, our food supply, quality of life, a specific important landmark, a specific shared hobby. There are a lot of common areas that you can find depending on your audience that will help you when you're crafting your messaging to really start to build both that relationship and initiate that outreach. I wanted to share two specific examples of projects that are either wrapped up from Thriving Earth Exchange's end or in progress. And these relate back to, if you remember in Olivia's initial introduction, she shared a couple of questions from the beginning. Who related to the issue that you're working on should know about this and why? Who are the groups that would benefit from, or what groups would help your project benefit if they knew more about it? And so this picture on the left is an image of Chalice Creek in San Diego, California. We had a community science project team wrap up last year. Their project was focused on designing a long-term monitoring method to track the pollution in this creek bed. And there were two goals associated with that project that really involved two diverging types of messaging. One was getting policymakers to be aware of the impact of this creek bed on local residents and families. And part of that in their messaging involved finding that common ground. They really leveraged the fact that the continued pollution in this creek bed put the health of community members and families and students who walked by this area every day to go to school at risk. So putting things into the context in terms of wanting policymakers to pay attention to anything that could put their constituents at risk was a really useful messaging tool for them. They also wanted to share the methodology that they came up with other communities across the US that might be facing similar challenges. So that included a different type of messaging and tool set that they moved forward on. And we'd be happy to share the links to those tools and products from this specific project in the chat later on. And then an active project we have involves a group that is doing an independent water assessment in an area. They wanted to make sure that there was a level of awareness in the community because the sites that they were doing field testing at were near residential areas. And they wanted to be as transparent as possible to those community members. So that was their tool for leveraging their message for local media outlets to make sure that there was clear, transparent communication between the group doing the testing and the folks who lived there that might not have been initially involved in the project development. Those are just two examples. I think every group on this call right now has a very focused project that could use some similar strategies, but we can craft them and customize them to what makes sense for your group. Okay. With that, I am going to pass it over to Nancy, and she's going to focus in on the first one of our big bucket audiences, which is the media.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. So the media as an audience, so that actually is me there on the left when I was a newspaper reporter interviewing a giant white squirrel, or a person in a giant white squirrel costume. But the point of that, I guess, these pictures is to think about the media as an audience. Not only are the reporters your audience, but their audiences. So who are they writing for? So when you're talking to the press, you're talking to a journalist, you're talking to the local television station, who are they writing for? Is it your local community? Or I think someone said they're trying to, maybe reach ocean conservationist type folks. Are you talking to a publication that really talks to folks interested in ocean conservation? Or is it more of a national publication? Are you in a big city and you want to reach more of a national level? So kind of thinking about, the press obviously as an audience, but who are they writing for? Can you go to the next slide, please? And to do that, you have to think about, doing some research on the publication that you want to talk to or do outreach to. Who is their audience, and what are they going to care about? And so when we talk about that, we think about too, like what's going to wind up in the paper, what's considered newsworthy. And this is to say that not everything that you do or we do at AGU is considered newsworthy. And not everything's going to wind up in the paper. And as we're going to get into, or in the online news site or wherever you're going for, as we're going to get into in the other workshops, there are many ways you can have relationships with the press, with the media, with journalists along the way. But just for this this introductory workshop, we're just going to talk a little bit about what makes something newsworthy. If you want to get a story in the paper, you want to get a story on their online website or on the local news or wherever it may be, what makes something newsworthy? And kind of we think about who's the audience, who's going to care about this result that I'm talking about or the project I'm talking about, and kind of does it pass the headline test? Can you write that quick headline that jumps out at you, and would someone pick that up and say, oh, that's interesting, I want to kind of read more? So can you go to the next slide, please? So when we think about newsworthiness, there's kind of some general criteria, and this is super general, just to get you thinking about, what makes something newsworthy, what makes something a story that's going to wind up in the newspaper. Obviously it has to be new, so it has to be something timely, maybe that's happened or coincides with an event that's happening. It has to be significant. Generally kind of incremental stuff is not going to make a big story, but if you have a significant result, you came out, you got your findings, you're kicking off your project, you're wrapping it up and you have a report to show for it. Local, which I guess for you all, for your projects, that's an easy one to hit. A lot of these are obviously local community projects. And so, it is going to impact the local community. They can actually, if you're talking to the local paper, they know how it's going to affect people living there. Odd or unusual, kind of something maybe not come up for you all that much, but something we deal with, just something that like is quirky and fun that you want to read about, that we'd pick up, you'd scan and you'd say, oh, that's interesting, I want to hear more about that. Human interest, again, I think that's something that you all in your communities and your projects it's going to be an easy one to find, how this impacts folks' lives. And then the superlatives, probably less so, but that's something that we also look for. Is this the first, the biggest, the longest, the oldest, all those kind of things. So this is just really general, but kind of a way to maybe judge and say, okay, is this the right point, point in time that I'm going to reach out to the media to talk to them about my project. Next slide, please. So another thing about communicating with the media that to keep in mind is really about how communicating with the media might be a little bit different than, say, giving a talk at a community group, or we say, writing a research paper. We deal a lot with the scientists, but you've all kind of, read those kind of reports and things like that. Journalists write a little bit differently. This is not to say that you have to talk in this way, but it's good to keep in mind when you're thinking about what do they want to know, what are they most interested in, when you're trying to frame your message and think about your message. And we're going to get more into messaging later in this workshop. So basically, news style. So like I mentioned, a research paper, or maybe you're giving a talk, we've all listened to it, or maybe we've read a research paper, just like a report, you kind of give the intro, the background, this is what I did, and then you get to, well, this is what I found, and this is why it matters. Kelly, can you go to the next one? But a news story, as we all know, we all read the news, kind of flips that on its head. And it's called, in news lingo, it's called the inverted pyramid. And this is how a news story is written. And basically it says, this is what I found, this is why it matters. And then you kind of get into the details, generally when you're reading something. Can you go to the next one, Kelly? And the reason for this is kind of has multiple reasons, kind of twofold. The first is, in the olden days of newspapers, and this still happens, I think, to some extent. Spaces is short in the newspaper, or on the TV, or wherever you're reading or listening or getting your news. So if you were writing it as a scientific presentation or just a talk that you're giving, if an editor is going to cut the story, they're going to start cutting from the bottom. And so you'd lose all that good stuff, all the results, all the conclusions, all the why it matters. And you'd be left kind of with like the background and what I did. But Kelly, if you can go to the next one, in a news story, if you do that same sort of cutting, you actually don't lose any of that meat. You get the gist. You get what happened. You get kind of what I found, why it matters, and maybe the details are lost, but that's okay. People can still come away with the story. And this also applies not just to the olden days of newspapers, which are still around, but also to all of us kind of have short attention spans. We read a lot of news online, maybe on our phones, when we were actually going places and commuting, maybe on the train, or wherever it might be, standing in line. So sometimes we just get to the first few graphs of a news story, but we want people to come away with what really the important stuff. So it kind of still rings true, I think, today. Can you go to the next one? And so that's not to say that you have to kind of talk in the inverted pyramid or anything like that. But I think it comes in handy when you're thinking about talking to the media as an audience, what they're looking for. And like I said, we'll get into that later in the messaging, but just something to keep in mind about how a news story is structured. And this kind of just drives it home. Here's a research article at the top in one of our journals. And it's kind of, basic kind of title for a research paper, quantifying the daily impact of extreme space weather due to failure in electricity transmission infrastructure. That's what this paper is about. But that's not really a headline that's going to grab you in the newspaper. The newspaper headline would be solar storm blackout could cost the US $42 billion per day. I mean, similarly, for your projects, I mean, the title of your project could be examining pollution in our local watershed or whatever it is. But that's not really the headline. The headline would be, local group finds, 40 million people are affected by pollution in this watershed or something like that. So that's kind of just the way to see how it kind of plays out and how you should kind of, think about it. When you're thinking about talking to reporters and what they need, what they want, what they're interested in. And I believe with that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz, who's going to talk a little bit about policy audiences.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Nancy. I see a number of people are already thinking about talking to policymakers, which is fantastic. I'm thrilled. We're going to work on that today. But there may be some who are wondering why talk to policymakers about your project at all. And so I want to address that first before we move forward. I know that sometimes it may seem intimidating to work with policymakers, or frankly, sometimes useless, depending on the particular policymaker or situation. But policymakers are the ones who can change laws, write bills, or other ways to make policies that can help your community. And their power isn't only in making laws, they also have relationships, knowledge, and influence. And that can really help your community in other ways also. And depending on which policymaker you're working with, they can have that knowledge and change laws anywhere from the town to the federal level. So really help make a difference where you need it. I've personally helped hundreds of people meet with policymakers for the first time, and most, if not all of them, were really intimidated before their first meeting. And at the end of every single day of those meetings, they would say to me, that wasn't really as scary as I thought it would be. It's just like talking to anyone else. So keep that in mind, and that policymakers are accountable to the people that they serve, and they're there to listen to their communities, including you. So let's talk about how to effectively work with policymakers. Next slide, please. Thanks. So hopefully you're thinking about how you can work with them, and let's talk about how to do that effectively. So I'm starting with the questions that Kelly brought up earlier. Although there are similarities between policymakers, the answers can really vary to these by person to person. So you'll need to do research and prepare a plan for working with each policymaker individually. Next slide, please. Starting at the top of this list, we have your project team's goals. And we'll actually do an exercise that's focused on that later today. So if you have any ideas for that, wonderful. Jot them down, type them out, hold on to them for later. The next two items here focus on the policymaker's goals, values, interests, and concerns. So let's talk a little more about this. How do you figure it out? How do you create a dialogue that helps you work with them towards common goals? Next slide, please. So you want to start out by doing a little homework, do your research. This is actually really easy to do online. You can check out their website and see what press releases they have put out, check their social media and see what they're sharing. You can use that to figure out their goals, what they want to achieve. And then with that information, you can make the connection between your project and their goals really explicit in your message. We have an exercise coming up to practice this. So if you're at a loss right now, don't worry about that. We'll help you out. But let me walk you through an example that might help. I have two tweets posted on this slide from Christina Henderson, who's a Washington, D.C. council member at large. And the one on the left, she mentions a bill that she introduced on maternal health. And so if I saw this on her Twitter, I might think, how could I connect this to my project? Well, if your project is improving the local environment in some way, you could connect environmental health to maternal health And that would be a way to connect your project to what this policymaker really values. The tweet on the right shows her concern for students, including immigrant students for whom English is a second language. So what connections could you maybe make there? Does your project help students in some way? Does it help immigrant communities? Is your project focused in a community made up primarily of traditionally underserved families? Find that connection, or a couple of connections if you can, to clearly show the policymaker that your project aligns with their goals. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that you can do your research online, and I want to talk more about what to research specifically and where to find it. This is easy for any policymaker, but especially easy for members of Congress because they always have a robust website up. So I'm going to talk about federal policymakers first, and then we'll talk about more local policymakers. So you can see a number of different things on the slide here. Going to their websites, the federal policymakers tend to have very robust websites. They're very similar and easy to find information on. You have the biography, so background on them. It'll include things like where they grew up, any jobs that they've had, their family. So that might be useful to find connections in. They'll also have the various positions that they hold. These can be on committees, which are really functional working groups that work on specific areas of policy. So you could see perhaps they're on the Natural Resources Committee or the Energy and Water Committee. And then you could try and make connections with that work that they're doing with your project. Or you could check their caucus list. Caucuses are informal groups that can form around any kind of topic, everything from the Congressional Black Caucus to the Candy Caucus. So you can really find some interesting ways to make connections there. Their legislation and voting record is available on sites like congress.gov or govtrack.us. And you can use that to find what kind of legislation that they have backed in the past, they've introduced, they voted for or against certain things. And you can figure out, are they generally for your issue, against it? You can really get into the nuances of bills and legislation as well if you're trying to figure out specifically things that they oppose or support in terms of water policy, for instance. Social media is really helpful as well. Just like I showed those tweets earlier, they'll be sending out messages about the bills that they're passing. When they have something new or exciting to share, they'll put it out in social media. It's also great to follow policymakers on social media if you are on social media yourself, because then perhaps they'll follow you back. You can message them directly or say send a tweet or post a Facebook message tagging them if you want them to see information. So it's a great way to have a dialogue with policymakers too. And then I highly recommend talking to government relations folks, whether that's at your institution where you work, or it could be us if you don't have another resource available to you. The staff at AGU is happy to help you out. I really recommend conversations with them as well, because they'll often have insider information on the various policymakers with whom you want to speak. And as you go through and look at this information, you want to think about where can you find those connections or interests? What are those bridges you can use to show them that your work is really integral to the goals that they want to achieve? You have to look at it from their perspective, not your own, and make sure that you adjust your message to make sense according to the legislator's values. Next slide, please. So let's talk through local policymakers now. And by that, I mean anyone who's not a federal policymaker. So this could be a town, city, state, tribal, or others. I highly recommend going to the ESAL website for information on local engagement. ESAL stands for Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. And even though the audience for the site is scientists who want to engage locally, the information is excellent and can be used by practically anyone. So let me walk through a couple of tools that they have available on their website. They have the local engagement playbook. This is great because this has step-by-step guides to figure out how to engage depending on which local policymakers you want to work with. The local STEM database is a database that has lots of science engagement information opportunities. So you could find something local in there that might be useful to your project. And the local engagement checklist is full of different ideas of ways to engage locally. In case you're not sure where to start, this is a great place to do that. So I do recommend starting here, checking these out in terms of finding pathways, because local policies and local policymaker positions really vary by region. You don't necessarily have the exact same positions in California as you do in Pennsylvania, or even from county to county, things may be different. So it's very important to figure out who the people are in power locally that you could work with. You'll also want to check out the website, press releases, and social media for your local policymakers, just like I recommended for federal policymakers. These websites may also vary more by policymaker at the local level, but what they have available will be really helpful to you. So this is my last slide of this introductory section. So I just want to pause and see if anyone has questions about policymaker audiences at this point. If I missed anything in the chat, the team wants to flag for me. Okay, great. Please do feel free to put anything in the chat if it comes up. Did I hear someone?
No, I was just going to say, I think we could kind of open it up to questions just in general on this section. If people have questions to type in the chat and let us know. One thing I saw, I think in the chat, there was some discussion about the idea of superlatives, and it's not about exaggeration. That wasn't what I was getting at. The superlatives is more, I think, as Olivia pointed out, it's if you can find that kind of angle that a reporter might think is interesting, you know, whether it be, oh, this is, you know, the oldest community in our area, or this is whatever it would be, you know, the biggest source of drinking water in our area, you know, those kind of things are things that people kind of are interested in. And also to to piggyback on what Liz was saying about finding information on policymakers, similarly, you know, finding information on reporters is kind of a similar task. See what they write about, you know, see what they write on social media, you know, find the right person to talk to, and also be knowledgeable what they write about, and how they write, you know, can be really helpful in thinking about who the audience is. So yeah, if there are any other additional questions that folks have in the chat or want to raise their hand, we'd be happy to answer any.
Yeah, Garrett?
Just a question thinking about policymaker goals. One of the maybe issues I'm dealing with the local policymakers is I feel like we share a common goal, but the incentives are what's lacking. There's not really an existing incentive for them to take the action to reach that goal. So I'm wondering if maybe we'll get into that, but that's just something I kind of wanted to flag as, when we talk about goals, do we see them as similar? And then how do we parse apart, particularly for these communities that we are not a part of as fellows, how do we really understand that incentive structure?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Garrett. Thanks for bringing that up. And I do think there are potentially some things that you can do to help add incentive to the policymakers. One thing in particular is getting some of those community members to speak up about the issue. And if they can hear a number of community voices, particularly if you could get you know, someone from a business owner, say, and someone who is a parent, and, you know, someone else who's a community leader locally, who are all coming in and saying that this issue matters to them, knowing that this is on the mind of a number of their constituents can incentivize this issue for them and maybe move it up the ladder of all the million things they have to get to. So that's just kind of one idea off the top of my head, and I'm happy to talk more about this later. I think it's a great question.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. And with that, Kelly, was there another one? Yeah, please.
Norma, I noticed your comment in the chat too. I sort of catching up in the chat, and I wondered if you wanted to speak more to that, just about how to choose when there are multiple matters to address. Do you have any insight from your end?
Thank you. I'm gaining insight. So just a little bit for everyone. I am one of those local policymakers. On the other hand, I don't consider myself an experienced one completely or immersed in that yet, because I come from the perspective of public health education. So I'm one of five council members in a small town. We do not have the resources, the secretaries, the staff, et cetera, to help us out. So it's really up to us as part-time policymakers to attend to different interests. And one thing that's important for everyone to know, I believe this is how it may work elsewhere, is that although there may be a single policymaker that is interested in a particular matter that we are interested in, any one of us here, for example, it's the entire council that has to decide on the matter. And so that's why my involvement here today is to try to persuade my fellow council members to attend to the project that I'm involved with today, through Thriving Earth Exchange. Although we have environmental health as a common goal, I'm very aware that we also have resource impediments. So your question about incentives, they can come in different ways. Sometimes indeed they are monetary incentives, resources that our particular jurisdiction needs in order to raise or elevate the issue that's environmentally related to something that perhaps competes with local fixing our streets, which is also a reality to our constituents. I'm all for constituents speaking up and giving us reasons for why we ought to address what they're interested in, and if we coincide on that given date, even great. But being a data-driven person, I, as one of 5 council members, also have to keep the data in mind, because again, we're competing with other issues. And so for me, I know very well that the more active people in my community aren't necessarily representative of all the issues that we have a responsibility to address. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Norma. I think that's a wonderful point. Yeah, there are so many different unique local policymaker positions, and some of them are part-time and don't have any help and don't get any compensation for it. And some of them are full-time and paid positions, and it really varies. And that can have also a huge impact on how you can best approach a policymaker. And knowing that is so helpful. I thank you for your perspective, Norma, and thank you for serving. It's incredibly important to do that. All right, if we don't have any other questions at this point, and please feel free to drop them in the chat, I'm going to hand it back to Nancy, who is going to talk more about effective communication tips for working with people who haven't necessarily had the same experiences as you or don't know much about your project at all.
Great. Great. Thanks, Liz, and thanks for all the questions. So now that you've kind of identified your audiences, excuse me, I think it's just a sip of water. You've identified your audiences. You want to make sure the next part is, how do you actually talk to these audiences, especially folks, as Liz said, who may not come from your background, may not have the same level of expertise that you have necessarily. So can you go to the next slide, please? So we call this kind of speaking the same language as your audience and the folks that you're trying to reach. Can you go to the next slide? What we're not talking about, and a lot of people say, oh, you're dumbing it down, and that's not actually at all what we're talking about. We're just talking about trying to use clear, simple terms. And we all kind of get bogged down when we're working on, even it's at work here at AGU, we use all these acronyms that people are like, new folks are like, what are you talking about? And I'm sure on your project or you're in your community, if someone were to drop in from outside, they may not know what you're talking about, something that everyone knows what that is. So just thinking about, using clear, simple terms, whether they're scientific or just unique to your project, avoiding jargon and acronyms, which we're going to get into a little bit more about jargon in a little bit, providing context. That's Exactly, AGU, an acronym, people might know what that is. And providing context. That means giving people, instead of, kind of the background, you're reading something and you're like, why do I care about this? Why are they even talking about this? But providing the context can really help people understand what you're trying to get across. And avoid getting bogged down in minor details. Kind of similarly, when we were talking to reporters, they may want those details, but you don't need to get into the nitty gritty. Folks will ask if they're interested, but don't worry about going down, thinking about the big picture when you're talking to, whether it be, the media or policymakers, or even like a local community group who may not be so deeply involved with your project. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so jargon, I mean, that's one, like I said, that we have everywhere, like AGU, which people be like, what's AGU? It's American Geophysical Union. We use a ton of different things that even probably in your own project, and like I said, in your own community, in your own work, these terms that you think kind of, similar to this cartoon, you think what you sound like, and someone actually is like, what are they talking about? So it's kind of this technical terminology, these acronyms, obscure words or long words, and then also words with multiple meanings, which is something that comes up a lot in science and other places too. So that's what kind of we mean by jargon, and we all know what that is. So it's just trying to avoid that, or if we have to use it, to try to define it so that everyone is on the same page and understands what we're talking about. So can you go to the next slide, please? So the word modeling, this is one of those words with multiple meanings. Yeah, can you go to the next, please? When most people hear that word, they don't think of computer simulations. And we all know, I mean, our scientists, that's what they deal with. A lot of them do modeling. Oh, it's a climate model. Of course, that's what I'm talking about. But someone on the street, that is not what they think about when they hear the word modeling. So something that's kind of a one to keep in mind. Can you go to the next one, please? Similarly, the word mean. When a scientist, talks about that, they're usually, can you go to the next one? Is talking about, that's the average, right? That's the mean, when I'm talking about a bunch of numbers. But to most people, if they hear the word mean, that's not what they think about. They think about someone being angry. So it's just things to think about like that, that come up in science. And I know you're working on kind of community projects, but obviously involving science. And so these words may creep in. So it's always good to think about those and can that be confusing to people? Something that you might not even think of that could be confusing to folks. We have a worksheet that I think Erin's going to drop in the chat and include. We have a bunch of resources for you all. And this is something just to do kind of on your own. Think about, what are the jargon in your own project, in your own field that you run into, and what's an alternative you can use? And if you really have to use it, how can you define it in a way that's like simple and clear and makes sense to folks? That sort of thing. And then there's some fun kind of words with multiple meanings on there too on the left-hand side. So I think that's something that we'll be sharing with you, right? Okay, great, excellent. I think with that, we're gonna go on to unless was there any questions at the moment? We're gonna go on to a little exercise that we have. But I'll pause here for a second to see if there's any questions that anyone has about jargon. No? Cool. Okay, so I don't know if you all are familiar with XKCD, but XKCD is it's a website, and Randall Monroe is the creator of the website, and he posts cartoons, and he has a degree in physics, so a lot of them are about science, and he was a scientist before that, worked at NASA, and he creates funny, poignant cartoons like the one on the one here, which is a funny one about being a scientist or a normal person. So that's fun. But the reason that I'm talking about XKCD is he developed a really fun kind of thing that he did. Can you go to the next slide, please? called the Upgoer 5. So what this is he explained, he decided to take the Saturn V moon rocket and explain every major component using only the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language. Well, Saturn and moon and rocket are not any of those. So, and he was actually able to explain the entire rocket using these really simple terms. Yes, Thing Explainer, I have that book too. And so he does this with all these different really technical things and does an awesome job of it. So a lot of people are familiar with this. So it's a lot of fun. And I really encourage you to check them out. So he comes up with the US Space Team's Upgoer 5. And so what he's done actually is they have online an Upgoer 5 text editor where you can kind of try this out. And it's a silly exercise. I mean, I know we don't normally talk in just the 1,000 most commonly used words, but it's a fun exercise to try to get you to think, well, how can I simplify this? How can I kind of think about how I can say things and write things as simply as possible? So can you go to the next slide, please, there? So there's a text editor online. Which what you can do is type in the box. And I guess, Kelly, can you bring up the online version? Is that possible? Okay.
Can you see it?
Yep. So I can't type in there. I guess, Kelly, you'll have to do it. So this is a text editor. So Kelly, can you cut and paste, I guess? I think we were going to use maybe the Thriving Earth Exchange mission statement as an example of just how this works.
Just dropped it in the chat box, Kelly, so you can grab that. Everybody can give that a read.
Maybe you want to just take that second sentence there. We help scientists. You want to just put that in the box? Oh, you're working on it.
I know
maybe?
from experience, it's probably hard. If you're sharing a screen, it's harder to access the chat box.
Yeah, she got it.
That's
So
okay.
as you can see, everything that's underlined in red is not one of the 1,000 most common used words. So, so it's fun. You can kind of come up with then. So we can talk about the second sentence because we help scientists. So, what's another word for scientists that might be more common? People who I don't know, anyone want to help me out here?
Study how things work.
People who study how things work. Try that one, Kelly. Is that better? Oh, that was a good one. So that's good. So we help people who study how things work. Community leaders. So that one might be Olivia, help me out here. You're good at this.
Oh, man.
Group or town?
Towns, people in towns, cities.
People who share the same interest.
Yeah.
Or who help guide. Yeah, I don't know if lead might be in there, Kelly.
Yeah,
leaders
people who lead, I don't think is in there.
Oh, it is.
People who lead cities. How about that? People who lead cities and towns.
Or groups of people with common interests.
Well, if you live in rural areas, that leaves the rest of us out.
Cities, towns, villages. Oh, villages is not. Small places.
Groups of
people who decide for other people. I like that. People who decide for other people. That's a really good one. Someone put in the chat.
Okay. I'm gonna get rid of common.
We don't have to go through the whole exercise here. It was just to give you an example of how you do this. But what we're going to do now is actually break out into breakout groups of 3 people each. And what you can, if you can pull up your community project, your project description, maybe start with just like the title and maybe a couple few sentences, and we'll give everyone, if in the group of the 3 people you want to just choose one person to offer up theirs, and go through this and try to come up with, using the Upgoer 5 language. And Kelly will put the text editor, I guess, link in the chat. If everyone as a little group wants to just come up with it, we'll meet back here maybe in 10 minutes or so and see what you all have come up with. All right, we're back.
Can we hear some of them?
You get very far.
Yeah, so I guess, who does anyone have one that wants to share?
Go ahead, Martin.
Okay. So I work with Rebecca and Earl at the agency. And we got through the first 2 sentences. So originally it was local environmental action demanded is a community-led nonprofit environmental justice organization founded in 1997. The organization focuses on ensuring that the northeastern Oklahoma region is safe for all community members. And what we wound up with is LEAD is a group that wants to make outside spaces safe and wants all people, not just some people, to live in safe spaces. It was founded in 1997. LEAD focuses on making its area safe for all its people.
That's great. That's
Nice.
awesome. Great. Yes. Excellent. Yay. Anyone else have one they want to share?
I have one because I'm in shock that their ocean, sea, and fish are not included in those 1,000 words.
I know.
So we looked at the mission. Our mission is to empower coastal communities to advance marine protected area management and encourage ocean stewardship, which now I realize is super wonky. And we ended up with, we bring together people by the water to care about water animals and save their home.
I love it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Water animals.
That's like super clear.
Water animals. There's no ocean, there's no sea, there's no fish.
Oh, that's great. That's excellent. That's great. Anyone else have one to share?
Okay, we had one, and I'm going to try to remember the original part. But basically, we are putting on a series of webinars to educate the public about wildfire issues, including emergency response, evacuation, and power lines, and so it wound up like this. We're helping people understand large fire problems by putting on a set of classes for people to learn about how to escape fire, make ground safe, buy time for people to save their homes, and making power lines safe. That's it.
No, that's great. I was working with Katie and I think we had similar, I don't know if you're on the same project. Yeah. These are all great. These are all great. And it's just a fun exercise, as you can see. We actually do this with scientists at our meeting, where the scientists present their entire research in Upgoer 5 language. So you can tell it's a lot of fun, but also just gets you thinking about how to really simplify things. So awesome. That was a lot of fun. So just so we get back on track, I guess we'll continue on with the Kelly, the next item.
Yes, one moment.
Okay, that's me. We'll talk a little bit about message making. And I will say too that, as Nancy was saying as well, the Upgoer 5 is a really fun thing to do. And you all did a really nice job, I think. But I want to just mention that when we've had people do it, we never say, and now go forth and talk like that to somebody in reality, because you might get hit with a stick. Or at the very least, people would think that you think they're stupid. So we're not, Well, if you can't use ocean, for example, that's not exactly going to help your case. But the great thing about it is that you can't use a lot of it. It's just the idea is you're breaking it down into its component parts, right? What you're trying to say. And then if you want to add back in the conversational words that aren't part of the 1,000, like nature, like ocean, like marine, those aren't things that are so obscure that they put people off. But you've already sort of broken it down first. So it's a lot easier to go from there than trying to work backwards from your technical version. Okay, and that ties very nicely into making messages. Next, please. Okay, so you have an idea now, you've thought about the kind of audiences that you want to talk with and what they care about and how you want to talk about what you're saying more broadly. Now you have to figure out precisely what are your talking points? What are the things that you want to really focus on? What is, again, like at the essence of what you're talking about? And that's what messages are. You're boiling down, you're distilling your information to a few clear points. And that's great because one, it again increases the clarity, but two, it really helps, especially if you're talking with an audience you might be less familiar or comfortable with, like let's say a journalist, you haven't done a lot of interviews. If you have these messages already developed, you can return to them whenever you feel you might be getting off track or the conversation might be moving in a different direction. Next slide, please, Kelly. So I'm just going to go over some basic examples of some ways to sort of help finesse messages in general. And then Liz and Nancy will talk about other ways to sort of refine messages for those specific audiences, the media or policymakers. So you really do want to focus on relevance for whoever your audience is. You could say something like levels of soil moisture in our area have decreased by 20% in the past 3 years. And that is boiling down information that you may know about or have found out through your project. But who's going to care about that? Next, please, Kelly. If instead you put it in the context of soil moisture decrease means that drought has intensified here. So that's put extra stress on our water resources. That's increased our risk of wildfires. Now you've made it relevant. Next, please. And using metaphors can be really terrific. I know nobody's studying migrating birds, but this was the one I could think of. So here we go. So you could say removing or developing small patches of wilderness can be devastating for migrating birds. Yeah, true. Next, please, Kelly. Or you could say, imagine heading out on a cross-country trip and discovering there are no more rest stops until Montana. That's how birds feel when we get rid of their stopover points. Next, please. Analogies are not always easy to come up with, depending on what you're working on, but they are so valuable when you can think of them because they are what people remember most. Arthur McDonald's, I don't know, probably not in this version of the world they're in. And so there's no sort of one easy answer to figure out an analogy for whatever you're working on, but there are some places you can look up online to sort of get an idea of how best to develop them. And I do really encourage that because if you can get one, especially one that's related to your audience, it's going to mean a lot more to them. Next, please. You really want to emphasize the value of what the issue is that you care about and what the project is going on. So you could say Park City, Utah has been developing a biochar program. Biochar is a charcoal-like material made from specially burnt vegetation that's rich in carbon. Okay, next please. By turning plant debris that would otherwise be wildfire fuel into biochar, which stores carbon, Park City can help reduce the danger of wildfires and figure out ways to cut down on the emission of heat-trapping climate change gases. It's the same project, but you're emphasizing the part where people can see the value that is obvious to you, but might not be obvious to them. Next, please. Social math. Oh, you can, it's fine, Kelly, that one's fine. Social math is always really valuable too, with any sort of measurement, but also with sort of concepts related to measurement. So when people talk about projected sea level rise, they're often giving amounts, like a quarter of a meter or something. But if you can change that to something more tangible, like a rise of this amount means that we lose our esplanade and the historic bandstand, and we put at risk almost 200 families' homes. That really means something. Next one, please, Kelly. And the next. This is good for money too. If you're talking about money and you have an amount, can you compare that to something? Can you talk about that in terms of car payments, in terms of mortgage payments, in terms of how much it costs to put a kid through college? Although I recognize that's fluctuating wildly these days. But even so, giving something a little more tangible is really helpful in allowing people to visualize what you're discussing. Next, please. And for social math, there actually are some resources out there that can help you with this, especially with various kinds of measurements, height, weight, volume, length. You can put in those numbers on a site like the Measure of Things, and they can actually tell you things like, oh, that's nearly the size of the Eiffel Tower, or that's, an Olympic swimming pool volume or something like that. So you don't have to do a search for this yourself. And that can be very helpful in a lot of situations. Next, please. And, we've been talking about trying to narrow things down, trying to compress, trying to distill, but that doesn't mean that you want to lose the context, right? So if you just say we want to save our local wetland because it's valuable to us. Okay, next please, Kelly. If instead you say wetlands provide a buffer against flooding, and this wetland protected our neighborhood from Hurricane Sandy, we need to take care of it so it can keep taking care of us. Now you've given just enough information that why you want to save the wetland is much more obvious. Next, please. And again, you want to give specific examples. So you could say, oh, there's an increase in invasive species in the Chesapeake Bay. Next, please. But really, you want to say, when Chinese mitten crabs come in and push out blue crabs, that's a loss of tens of millions of dollars for our Maryland economy each year. Next, please. And finally, if your goal relates to getting people to take action of some kind, if you have a call to action involved, you really don't want to just focus on doom and gloom. Because if you tell everyone that the end of the world is near, they're not going to recycle anything. And if you make people feel despairing or hopeless, that is not a motivator. So it's reasonable to talk about if there are serious things, if there are bad things that are happening, you want to bring them up. But then you want to end with what people can do and why it matters. Next, please, Kelly. So you want to talk about the opportunities that people have, that your audience has, if they take action to protect or maybe even improve quality of life, to ensure that our children, our grandchildren are going to have a better world than the one we have now. And I think that's the end of my general message development tips. I'm happy to take questions in the chat now, or we can let Nancy go on to messages for the media. Or out loud,
Well, I guess I can start with the crafting messages for the media. So using what Olivia was talking about, kind of about the general ideas about messages and the things you want to keep in mind. When you're talking to the media, there's certain ways that you're going to want to think about crafting your message. Kelly, can you go to the next one? So basically, when you're talking to a reporter, journalist, they want to know kind of three things. What do you know, what's new, and why it matters. Of course, there's details to all of those, but that's the general gist to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about, crafting your message and thinking about what you want to get across. Next slide. So basically, the idea of what you know, what's kind of the context, what's the background, what's the frame of reference? It could be, say you're talking about, a polluted waterway. There's this river in our town, and there was a big, paper plant on it, and we know that they dumped a lot of pollution in it years ago. What's new? Well, we did a study and we found out that, actually the pollution level was this high. It was affecting this many people. This is the first time we've done this kind of study. And why it matters. I mean, why do we care? Well, we care because we want to know, how it's affecting folks and what we can do to clean it up and what we can do to prevent it. So that's kind of just keeping in mind, these kind of things when you're talking to the media, crafting your messages, using those ideas that Olivia was talking about, in thinking about how you want to kind of come up with how you talk to the media, how you, if you're writing a press release, if you're giving an interview, all of these things. Next, Kelly. And here's just an example. I was talking about the river, but this is one, a press release that we had, and I kind of thought it may be, maybe relevant to some of the projects that you are working on, or you can kind of relate to it a little bit, that wildfire smoke deaths could double by 2100. Go to the next one. So basically, the idea is, what do you know? Well, we know that wildfire smoke can reach nearby communities. It's bad for human health, and that wildfires are becoming more frequent and more intense because of climate change. So that's what we know. What's new? Well, what we found is that how much it's going to increase, and how much wildfires are going to increase in the coming decades, and how much worse it could be for folks in the area. So it's going to increase deaths by this much, up from what we have today. And why it matters? It matters because we want to know how harmful this is, but also it matters because maybe we can do something about it, that we can prepare for it, or we can mitigate it. Next one, please. So when you kind of think about all that stuff and boil it down, you want to think about, what's the take-home message? What's the message that you want someone, if they just read that story and go on with their lives, to come away with? The one thing you want them to take home, maybe take action on, really to leave them with, and kind of thinking about taking those three pieces and boiling it down to, boiling it down to that take-home message. You go to the next slide, please. So for example, for this one, your take home message, and it doesn't have to be one particular thing, but for example, something could be like, people could use this information as an estimate of how we can prepare. And we need more kind of simulations like this to be able to predict what's going to happen. Or another take home message is, our exposure to wildfire smoke is only getting worse in the next century. So we need to plan and be prepared to protect human health. So just kind of thinking about that, and kind of, if you're sitting at, we work with some reporters who, one good thing is they sitting at a bar with a guy in the town, and you want him to take away that one message. Why do I care about this? Why are you telling me about this? Well, this is why I'm telling you about this, and this is why you should care, in a very succinct way. Next, please. And just to keep in mind, like I said, we're going to do more workshops, really delving, really getting into the nitty gritty about how you work with the media and all these things. But just to keep in mind, about on a basic level about crafting your messages, we often hear from folks, well, I talked to a reporter, they got it all wrong. They didn't, they misquoted me and they got the whole story wrong. So what we like to say is, it kind of, the onus is on us as folks who are talking to the media to help them get it right, because in most cases, hard to, they're not going to let you read their story. It's just a fact of how most newspapers work, most news outlets work. So the best thing that you can do is to be prepared. Prepare those messages in advance. Write them down. Practice them in front of the mirror. Practice them with someone who's not on your project, has no idea what you're talking about. Be as clear as possible and practice so you can get it down. So those messages are easy to come to. You can keep repeating them. You got that take-home message that you want to get across. And then when you're actually talking to a reporter, it's okay to be like, can you repeat that back to me? Does this make sense? Do you understand it? Offer to fact check for them, or offer to be an expert for them. Sometimes it's even good to follow up with an email and say, oh, I just wanted to make sure, I got across XYZ. We also have a press release template, I think, which Erin can share. That's kind of announcing the project, and we'll have ones further along, maybe at different stages. But a press release is also a good way that you get your message right across. It's in front of them, so when they're going to write their story, maybe they bring up the press release, so they kind of know maybe some of those little details. And so that's just I think that's my last slide. Oh, there's one more. Just on we have also, I think Erin's going to share a worksheet on tips for science interviews. So these are just like basic tips. Like I said, we'll probably get into further workshops into more details, but if different kinds of interviews, just things you might do to prepare. But basically any kind of interview you're going to have, prepare your messages in advance. And that's what the right side of this worksheet can help you with. What do you know? What's new? Why does it matter? And what are kind of one or two things that you want folks to take away from it? So hopefully that will be helpful to you all. I'm happy to answer any questions now, or I know Liz is going to get into a little bit about messaging to policymakers. So, we can take some questions after that as well.
Thanks, Nancy. I think for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and please put questions in the chat. All right, so I'm going to talk more about messaging specifically to policymakers. Next slide, please. So your audience research that you did based on what I talked about earlier today will give you the information that you need to start connecting the dots for the policymaker that you're going to talk to, or policymakers. So you want to think about things like, how is what you are doing impacting their constituents? How does it connect to what they really care about? And you want to use that information that you've collected and thought about to create your message to show the policymaker why they should care about your work in terms that they will relate to and feel compelled by, thinking about those tips that Olivia just gave in terms of communicating messages effectively. So this really applies to policymakers at all levels. Next slide, please. So how do you use effective messages to create allies and build bridges between the policymaker and your community? So here are just some of the ways you can connect. Check these options out and see which works for you. You only need a couple of these. You definitely don't need to identify connections for all 6 of them. So the first one, and maybe the easiest, is a geographic connection. If they're a local policymaker or if they're a federal policymaker who represents your local community, this is usually an easy one. Think about what is it locally that matters, that makes a difference to those constituents, what impacts them at that local level, and really talk about that. The next one is occupation. This could be for someone who's serving, part-time in a policymaker position, their current occupation other than being that policymaker part-time, or if they're, say, someone at a federal level who's a policymaker full-time, what was their occupation beforehand? If someone worked in the healthcare field and you're working on an environmental health issue, there's a great connection there, and they're probably really interested in what you have to say if you frame it in that function, in that way. The next one, I mentioned committees before. These are really those working groups where the policymakers wind up having a lot of deep knowledge and are likely very interested on work that's going on in those areas. So definitely take a look at those committees and see, what kind of messages would resonate with someone who is interested in these kinds of issues or working on them regularly. Caucuses, I mentioned before, these are the more informal groups. These are everything from the beer caucus to the agricultural caucus. They have a little bit of everything. So it's a great way to find those interests that can help connect you, and you can figure out ways to message that will be, resonating with the policymaker based on those interests. What policies are out there? What language are they using when they're talking about these various policies? How can you connect with something that they really care about or they've put forward themselves? And then, of course, constituent priorities is really number one. If you can bring in those messengers locally, those constituents who can talk about how this matters to them, if you can create a message in a way that talks about how critical this is to the constituents, that is going to be really helpful. So hopefully those examples will help you come up with some ideas for connections to help you make those messages that will allow you to collaborate more effectively with policymakers. Next slide, please. And I also want to remind everyone to think about how the project is impacting the community. That's really your power as the constituent to showcase the locality and how important it is to the people that that policymaker is serving. And if you have a university or lab or other facility that's involved locally, that's a great thing to talk about as well. That's often something those policymakers really care about. And so that's something to mention. And whatever the ongoing issues are, the relationship between the community and this project, what the future holds, these are all really important things to be thinking about in terms of that messaging aspect. Next slide, please. I think really the most important take-home message I have is that it's up to you as the person who's going to this policymaker, wanting to work with them on something or asking for something, to show them how supporting your issue also supports their values and their constituents. Next slide. And I just want to cover something a little unique about talking to policymakers, which is that they often expect you to request something of them. And it's normal that you ask them for something because it's their job to help their constituents in their community. So oftentimes they're expecting that whenever someone comes in their door or gives them a phone call. So I have a few options for types of things that you can ask for as part of your collaboration with policymakers. You want to think about, is there a specific policy change that will help your project or community? Definitely make sure it's something that they actually have the power to do. You may have like different specific policy change requests for different policymakers. For example, something that is a local bill versus a federal bill. You want to go to the policymaker who can actually make that happen. Funding needs is another option. The policymaker can't just hand you money, but some of them can pass legislation that funds something that would help your goals. Again, you want to be really specific and have a plan worked out ahead of time if possible. This is a great thing to work on with your government relations folks because they can help tell you what's reality, what's not, who to work with, that kind of thing. And you can also ask them to be a partner with you and to consult with you on the issue. They can come visit your project site or see it virtually. They can talk with the community members. They can get the word out about what you're working on and the community that you're helping. So let them know specifically what you want them to do so that they know how to help out. All right, next slide. I think it's my last one here before we jump into a quick exercise to wrap us up. These are really the key components to working with policymakers, and these will help you set up your conversations or meetings with them. Make your request or ask of them, letting them know clearly how they can help your project or your community. It's normal actually to make this request early on during the meeting, just like Nancy talked about sharing the main point or key outcomes right up front when you're talking with media. And then it's critical to make that connection between your project and their goals using something from the list that I provided or something else that you found. It's also helpful to tell stories about individuals, the community, or something else compelling. Stories are a really effective and memorable way to communicate, and they resonate with policymakers just as well as anyone else. But we'll have a whole other course on that later this year, so look forward to that. Next, I'm going to transition to talking about goals, and we'll do a quick goal setting exercise. So if anyone has questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll address them there. Okay, so we are going to help you set your goals in this exercise. I'm going to walk you through a worksheet and answer any questions. Thank you so much, Erin, for dropping that in the chat. Yeah, you can go ahead and click through there. I'd like everyone to take about 5 minutes to work on the worksheet alone after I walk you through it. And then we'll pull everyone into breakout groups so you can share your plans and get feedback for another 5 minutes or so. And then we'll wrap up with just a couple minutes at the end. And yes, please do download a copy so you can edit it individually, as it is a template for everyone to share. So as you can see, the worksheet will take you through step by step in order to develop an achievable but ambitious goal to work with whoever your audience is that you want to reach out to. Policymakers, the media, other community members, whoever that key stakeholder is who isn't part of the project itself. And then it'll walk you through step by step a number of questions. And then if we could see the next slide, please, you'll wind up with something like this at the end. We have a little bit of a fill in the blank. And you may have a goal at the end that says, I will work with our community to contact our City Council representative, Elizabeth Landau, every month that we're working on the project. And once after the project is complete, through emails and virtual meetings, including my collaborators, Kelly and Olivia, we will share project updates and compelling stories with them in order to achieve our goal of having the city change its policy to allow dumping of chemicals into local sewers. by December 2021. And if you could click one more, Kelly. We have this little prompt essentially to put this all together. If you want to do this in your own format instead, that's fine, but the questions will help you get there. All right, so we'll just hang out for a couple of minutes and let everyone work on that, and then we'll do a short sharing portion, and then we'll wrap up.
Hey, that's all, folks.
So it's over. Okay.
Yeah, I know we didn't give you too long to work on that, but
It's
hopefully
only
that's
the
an
beginning.
exercise. Yes, hopefully it's an exercise you can take back and actually work on with your project teams. Does anybody have any questions before we do the final wrap up? Comments, observations? Great. Well, with that, the most famous message of all. Anybody can do a Porky Pig imitation here for me? Because I'm not going there, but somebody feels confident. Okay, next slide. So just to wrap up, your plans will change. Things are very fluid in communities and politics and science. So what you develop here or when you take this back to work on with your project teams, your plans may change, and that's great. You should think of everything that we've gone over as a living document. Likewise, communication is fluid. People come and go in politics, people come and go in media, people move in and out of your communities. So just keep your focus on who really needs to hear the message that you have, who you want to engage with, even as allies, not just kind of recipients of a message. And you have this, and we're here to help. I think Olivia has touched on this a lot, Liz and Nancy as well. Let us know if you have specific requests for future webinars. We can talk about everything from working with young school children to starting ballot initiatives, whatever would be of most help to the sort of things that you're working on specifically. Likewise, let us know if you need specific tools or resources. And let us know what you thought of today's webinar. I do have a fun survey link that I'm going to drop into the chat. I'll also send this in the follow-up email, as well as recording link and the slide deck. But please let us know what you think, what we can do better, what you'd like to hear more about. And sign up for the next webinar, which will also be included in that next email. So we have a series of webinars coming up. They are also very fluid and very much open to what you guys want to hear about. So with that, it's 5 on the nose. We'll stay here a few minutes longer if anybody has anything they want to talk about. Otherwise, thank you very much for sticking it out with us for the whole 2 hours. And I hope you all found this really useful.
Bye, thanks.